say one exciting way to be talking about what's coming up. We got some mugs we'd love for you to take home today. A lot of other information on this table, pens and stickers and brochures and things that help explain and celebrate what God has been doing and how we are excited to look towards the future and prepare to build for greater impact here in our community for the name and sake of Christ, so that people can know Jesus, so that people can grow to follow him, and so that we as Christians can also go and help others to do the same. As you came in today, you might have been handed one of these, or you've seen them already before, these commitment cards. If this is new to you, or if this is a surprise, you're not allowed to do anything with this today. You have to take this home. You're not allowed to fill this in. If you want to take it home and pray about it and then do something, that's fine. But this is not something that we are asking our visitors or those who have not spent time praying about to participate in at this time. We are excited to take a next step as a church. And I want to tell you what it doesn't look like. My wife and I, it was her birthday on Monday, and so we went up to Sag Harbor and we went out for lunch, and we had a very attentive waiter. He was really good at his job, and he was constantly, any time saying, hey, can I bring you some of this? Can I bring you some of that? All right, that's a great order. Can I also provide? And what I realized is every time he was asking if he could bring something, it was something that was going to cost another $10 or $15 or $20 more. And I went, this guy is smooth. I got to be careful that I say no to anything he says. And wait, no, yeah, okay, yeah, the food is good, but no to whatever else you thought you were going to do. And I just want to start out by saying we're not going to try to guilt you or shame you or upcharge or upsell you today. That's not what's going on here at all. But we are excited about looking to the future and doing things God's way. We've been talking for the last few weeks. We started with David. And David declared that everything that he had, everything that we give, comes from God and is given back towards him. And the people in the day of David gave willingly and wholeheartedly, without guilt or obligation, but with joy. Last week we talked about Esther and Mordecai, and we asked the question that was asked of Esther: what if you're here for such a time as this? What if we are able to be involved in what God is doing? We're in the places of work we're in the relationships we're in, and we're in this church and in this community to be involved for such a time as this. And what if, like in those days, it starts with prayer? Today we're going to be in the book of Ezra, and we are going to discover a couple of things, and that is that great callings, hard callings, God's callings require two things. They require great sacrifice, and they require great dependence. Now, the background of the book of Ezra is actually pretty similar to that of the book of Esther. The kingdom of Israel and Judah have been exiled, taken over by the kings of Babylon and later of Persia. And they are there in that area of modern-day Iran and Iraq. And at this particular juncture in the book of Ezra, we find people begin to return back to Jerusalem to rebuild what had been destroyed years before. And so we begin in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, and it says this. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, in order for God to keep his promises that he had made and are recorded in his word, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and put it into writing. So in order for God to accomplish what God had promised he said he would do, God moved in the heart of a pagan king in order to accomplish what he had promised he would do. And here's what it says. Notice, first of all, that every calling begins with God. God moves in this heart, and that's why Cyrus writes this. He says, this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all kingdoms of earth, from Egypt to India, and he appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And the people of any place where survivors may now be living are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with free will offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. And so the king declares, you may go back to Jerusalem to rebuild what the kings before me destroyed. And whoever wants to go, go. And those that can't go, send. help them go to rebuild this temple. So one group went, one group gave, but they all sacrificed so that it would happen. As we look ahead as a church as well, we recognize that our future involves all of us. And in order for us to be a church that's helping people to know, grow, and go to even greater extent than is already happening now, it's going to require sacrifice, but it's going to look different for all of us. We have an incredible team of people here at this church, whether that's builders and carpenters or architects or people who are familiar with town boards and have worked on those, or the designers of plans and of the materials to be able to explain them better, of printing, of party planning and events, of strategizers and administrators, of youth and kids and leaders and mission-focused individuals, that when we all come together, some incredible things can happen as each different part works as one, just as in that day. Not everybody's the same, but we all join together for a common goal and a common purpose. And so the people prepare to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild this temple, and we read in verse 5, then the families, heads of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. We see a key component here, that God is the one who moves in people's hearts. It goes on and says in verse 6, all their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, with valuable gifts, in addition to all free will offerings. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out of the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God. God moved in the heart of a king to make a proclamation that people could go back and rebuild. God moved in the hearts of people to respond, to go or to send. Some hearts were moved to go, some hearts were moved to give, some hearts were moved in different ways, but everyone sacrificed, everyone moved, everyone obeyed the call of God as he moved in their hearts. And even the king returned what had been plundered to go back to the temple to be rebuilt. See, things change when God moves in hearts. When God moves in your heart, when God moves in ours. And so we read, if you jump down to chapter 2, after Ezra records all the things that everybody contributed and sacrificed and who went and so forth, it says in verse 68, when they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for this work. See, it's a lot like Jesus when he was at the temple and the widow came with her 2 small coins and gave willingly. God said, that's giving. It's not about the amount, it's about the heart. And in a similar sense here, Ezra records that the people went, and it wasn't about the amount. They didn't all give the same. They gave according to how God had entrusted, how God had blessed them, and they gave according to their own abilities. As we look to the future, it's not about a specific amount that God requires us to give to this project or this church or that event or that ministry. God looks at our hearts. Are we involved in the work of God in this world? Do we know Jesus? And are we learning to follow him with every area of our life? And are we going and investing it in places and in people and in opportunities that can multiply followers of Christ in this world? And they all lived happily ever after. Yeah, right? You know, everybody sacrificed, everybody gave, and that's it, right? No, because this is not a fairy tale. See, the reality is God moved in people's hearts. God moved and people responded, whether they were kings or leaders, people who were rich or people who were poor, people who went or people who stayed. God moved in hearts to begin a great work, and people arrived and said, let's begin. And as always happens, when God begins a calling in people's hearts and there is progress for the name of God, opposition arises. And so in the case of the people in Jerusalem, they began to build, and the people said, hey, let us help you. They said, no. And when they didn't accept the help, we read in Ezra chapter 4, verse 4, then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. Hold on to those two words there, discouragement and fear. Verse 5, they hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to a couple of more kings, the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Verse 24, thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. There are times in our lives where perhaps we would respond a lot like the people in this day, where they say, God was at work, God is moving, we all got excited, we all got started, we all began, and it looked like it was great, it looked like God was with us, and then something happened, and it all got derailed. Now, maybe that's something that we as a church, or we as a group, or a ministry, or as a family, or as an individual encounter, but we all encounter at one time or another, or two of Satan's favorite tools to use, of fear and discouragement. That when God is moved in our hearts and we begin to respond, he wants to trip us up and stall us, just as he did here with these people as they begin to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Satan says, we got to stop. We got to sabotage what God is doing. We're going to discourage, and we're going to make the people afraid to continue doing what God has called them to do. Perhaps in your life, God has called you to follow him in one way or another, to pattern your relationships, your marriage, your parenting after his word, to forgive or to love or to be humble, as he says. And we start out well, and Satan trips us up with his familiar tools of fear and discouragement. And we wonder, man, how are we supposed to go on from here? I think we can learn from the example of the people rebuilding the temple who stalled out in their rebuilding for as few as 15 and as many as 48 years, depending on how you understand the Persian kings and their dates and how long they reigned and when this was. So it wasn't just like they stopped for like a week. This was years and years, possibly decades, where everything stopped, where there didn't feel like there was progress happening. Ezra chapter 5, verse 1, it says this. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Now, what is it that he said? Fortunately, we have the books of Haggai and Zechariah in our own Bible. So in Haggai chapter 1, verse 2, it says this. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. God sent messengers, Haggai and Zechariah, because there were people in that day who'd been fearful, who'd been discouraged, who'd stalled, who'd quit, and who were saying, let's wait a little bit until the time is right to do what God has called us to do, to pursue that calling that he stirred in us that we began those years ago, but right now it's not the right time. We're still going to do what God wants, but later. And so God sent messengers to confront the fearful, the cautious, the wait a bit people who said, the king said to stop, so we've got to stop. As a church and as an individual, there will be times in your life where God has called you to go, and you feel like the time's just not quite right. And we are listening to the voices of discouragement and fear more than the voice of God. Haggai chapter 1, verse 13. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people who said, it's not quite the right time. He says, I am with you, declares the Lord. And when you are discouraged, or when you are afraid to respond to the calling of God in your life in whatever area it might be, we all need this same reminder that God is still with us. He will never leave you nor forsake you. And as Romans chapter 8 says, that nothing can separate you from the love of God that has been shown through Christ Jesus. See, so often we get discouraged, so often we get afraid because we forget that God does love you and nothing can separate you from that. And the proof is that he died on the cross, not the problem that you're facing now. The proof for the people of this day who were rebuilding this temple that God had been at work was not in the fact that one king had said go and one king had said stop, but in the call of God itself. And so we read of what God did next. In verse 14, it says, "So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. And you know what? The Lord stirred the spirit of the whole remnant of the people." And so we read that they came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty their God when they remembered that there is opposition, there are obstacles, but God is still here. God has still called us to obey and to follow and to pursue him. And God stirred in the hearts of his people to say, God is still here. God is still at work. And they began to pursue and to follow what God had called them to do, despite the reality that nothing had changed for years. They began to build. And they relied on God despite the opposition. Now, there were still many dangers. There were still many risks. There was still a lot of reasons they could have had to not build or to wait for the right conditions. But God sent Haggai and Zechariah to encourage the people that God was still with them and calling them to obey him. Now, things weren't perfect, but God was still in their midst, and God had gotten them this far, and that same God would be the one who would complete the work. That's true of your life, too. Now, the same God who has brought you this far will be the one who completes the work he began in you, because he will never leave and forsake those whose lives he is a part of through Jesus Christ. As we look ahead, and as we look ahead at the expanded opportunities of ministry through this new building, we could also be cautious and say, we should wait until the time is right, till every condition is in our favor, for wars to stop, for bank accounts to be fat, and for inflation to be low. We could forget and we could ignore the work of God in our hearts, in our midst, and in our community, or we could be the people of like that day, who recognize that God, who began a work, will see it to completion, even if there is opposition. Now, the people here, they began to work before the king had even changed his mind. They just said, God is here, God has called us, and we need to begin the work. And the local officials there who were in charge of overseeing the area said, hey, you can't do that. And I said, we're going to do it anyway. God told us to. They're like, no, you can't do that. I said, well, there was a king once who told us to. You know about Cyrus? Well, we're going to send for confirmation. And they continued to build as they sent a message back to the new Persian ruler, Darius. And he looked into it, and he searched through all the records, and they found that Cyrus had ordered the temple to be rebuilt. And so they respond to the rulers in that area who are telling the people in Jerusalem, stop building. They said, don't stop them, help them. In fact, give them everything they need in order to succeed in the building of this temple. And so we read in Ezra chapter 6, verse 13, then, because of the decree of King Darius had sent to help them, give them everything they need, supply, so that they can complete this project, Tatanai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar Banzai, it's not Banzai, but let's go with that, and their associates, they carried it out with diligence. These guys say, all right, we're going to do what the king said, and what the king said is to build the temple. They finished building the temple according to the commander of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. And when they completed it, for 7 days they celebrated with joy the feast of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria. So he assisted, he helped them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. The work was completed. The work was celebrated because God changed hearts, God used a king, and God completed what God had called his people to obey and to sacrifice for, even when it got difficult and they were told to stop. If we're going to succeed in our Christian life, and if we're going to succeed as a church in the pursuit of this big step for us, as we look to the future, I think it's going to require these same two things that it required from them. That we sacrifice together, and that God stirs hearts and attitudes and minds of people and of leaders and of governments and of those around us. And so I've been asking this question a lot these last few weeks. The question, what if? What if as we look to the future and want to be a church and want to be people who are pursuing God's mission for us as individuals and as a church, God's mission for us to be involved in, what if? What if God has called us, God has called me, God has called you to more? Now, for each of us who call ourselves Christians, God has called you. God has called for you to grow, to follow Christ, for your life to be after the pattern of Jesus, to be less and less like sin and more like Christ. And it is a lifelong journey and process as God stirs in our hearts and points out an area where we go, man, this is kind of a selfish me area that needs to be surrendered to Christ, and I want to follow you here. And as God stirs in our heart and we run into opposition and go, man, this is hard. I'm kind of discouraged. I keep failing. I keep falling. Why is this difficult? The same message that was given to the people then is an encouragement for us now that God says, I'm still here. I am still with you. And that he who began a good work in you will see it to completion. We also as a church, we gather and we recognize that God has had an impact in our world. And God has specifically had an impact in our community through this church and the faithfulness of those before us and among us who say, what if God has called us to continue to pursue this mission in even greater ways? And because of what God has been doing in bringing people to know Jesus, because of what God has already been doing in helping people to grow and follow him, because of what God has already been doing in bringing us to go and multiply followers of Christ, we look to the future and say, God's not done, and so we can't be done either. What if God is calling us as individuals and as a church to more? What if obedience to God now, just like then, requires sacrifice, personally and corporately? What if it requires sacrifice not just for this building, but it requires sacrifice for our marriages, for our relationships? What if it requires sacrifice to learn humility, to spend time in prayer, to read God's word and connect with those around us? Ezra records that all the people sacrificed. Some gave, some went, but everyone pursued what God had called them to do. With their different gifts, different talents, different abilities, all together pursuing what God had called them to do. And what if there's opposition? Let me change that. There will be opposition if you are obeying and sacrificing to pursue what God has called you to do and what God has called us to do. As we say, we are not content with where we are at as individuals or at as a church, but we want to pursue the call of God in this world. There will be opposition to what God has called us to do. So what if, just as with the people then, we must depend on God to work? Depend on God's presence with us. Depend on God's transforming heart and attitude and mind changing power at work in our world. What if God's called us to more? What if obedience requires sacrifice? And what if when we face opposition, we don't become afraid and discouraged? Instead, what if we come back to the God who's called us in the first place and depend on him and say, God, I can't do this, which is kind of the point. I need your help. And here in this place of dependence where we learn obedience and sacrifice to the calling of God in our lives is when we individually and when we corporately truly begin to make progress to the calling of God in our lives and in our world. Join me in prayer.